I clicked the fob, locked the pickup, and hauled the heavy grocery bag up to the porch. Same route I'd taken for 2 years now, car to door, eyes on the ground. Losing my wife had burnt out whatever urge I'd had to talk, to smile, to pretend life was still moving forward. My place on the edge of Austin had become a fortress, where the only sound, most nights, was the TV mumbling to itself. The lot next door belonged to an old man whose name I never bothered to learn in all that time. We'd nod at each other when we both wheeled our trash cans to the road on Tuesdays. He lived alone too, moved slow, always wore this old cap from some local baseball team and a gray work jacket. Our separate worlds seemed solid enough. Until one Thursday I got the lawnmower wheel stuck in a deep rut right on our property line. The drive belt was screaming, the blade hitting rocks, and I was just yanking the steering wheel like an idiot, getting madder at myself by the second. The neighbor was messing with some boards on his porch. He heard the noise, set down his drill, and came over slow, carrying a spade. He didn't say a word, took one look, jammed the spade under the front wheel for leverage. I threw my weight on the back axle. We both heaved against the plastic body, and the thing lurched out with a crunch. I killed the engine. In the quiet after, you could hear us breathing hard. He straightened up, leaned on the shovel handle, and nodded at the torn-up ground. Turns out there was an old drainage pipe under the sod. Finally collapsed after the spring rains. He adjusted his cap and said in this rough, gravelly voice that we'd have an ugly hole here now unless we filled it. Then he added that he'd had a maple sapling sitting in a bucket behind his shed for 2 weeks. His nephew brought it over, but he hadn't gotten around to planting it. I looked at the gap in the grass, then at him, and realized something. For the first time in a long while, I didn't want to bolt back inside. I told him I could grab a bag of potting soil and a bucket of water from my garage, if he wanted to plant the thing right there, in the middle. 10 minutes later, we were working together. He carefully widened the hole with his shovel, tossing sod clumps aside, while I wheeled over dirt and pruning shears from my garage. We barely talked, like we'd been doing this forever. He held the thin, fragile trunk, just a few pale green leaves on it, while I packed dark, damp soil around the roots. My fingers got filthy, dirt jammed under my nails, but that physical feel of something real brought this strange relief I couldn't explain. When I tamped the earth down with my old sneakers, he poured a whole bucket of water over the roots. It sank slow, bubbling, leaving black sludge on the surface. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, looked at our work, and said we'd need to keep an eye on this stick, or the Texas sun would fry it in a week. I agreed, promised to run my hose out here. That's when we finally told each other our names, shaking hands quick. His was Thomas. His palm was dry, calloused, hard. Then he turned and walked home with his shovel, and I stayed there by that little maple, feeling something move inside me that I hadn't felt in a long time, something like interest in tomorrow. The summer turned dry, and that maple needed constant attention. First few weeks I just kept my promise. Every evening after 6, I dragged the long green hose across the yard to the line. Thomas was usually already there, sitting in a plastic folding chair with a cold beer. At first we stuck to short stuff, whether the tap water was any good, but gradually those evening meetings by the tree picked up rituals. I started bringing a second chair, and we'd sit on that boundary for an hour, sometimes two. The maple took hold, its stem thickened, the leaves turned this deep, healthy green. Watching Thomas carefully tie the branches with soft twine so the prairie wind wouldn't snap them, I caught myself thinking, this old man had become my only window to the world. He never asked the extra questions about my grief, never offered the hollow condolences that made me sick the first year after my wife's funeral. Instead, he told plain stories from his life, working at the furniture factory, how he buried his dog 3 years back and never got another one. By fall, the tree had shot up noticeably, and our conversations moved past gardening. When Thomas's back door lock jammed, he didn't call some expensive service, just knocked on my window. We spent 3 hours in his entryway, taking apart that old brass mechanism, oiling springs, arguing about whether modern locks were any good. For the first time in years, I didn't eat alone. Thomas made me stay and split a roasted chicken he'd bought at the local supermarket. After that, I started helping him with heavy groceries, and once a week I'd drive him in my pickup to the builder's market for lumber and paint for his never-ending shed repairs. The solitude I thought was my only salvation started feeling like dead weight. I noticed I wasn't turning on the TV for background noise anymore. My head was too busy replaying conversations with Thomas from that day. We genuinely started worrying about each other. If I didn't see him on his porch by 10 in the morning, I'd walk over without fail to make sure his old heart hadn't given out overnight. 3 years passed. Our maple grew into a sturdy young tree, its crown already throwing thick shade. In that time, Thomas became truly irreplaceable to me. We celebrated Thanksgiving and Christmas together, taking turns cooking the turkey at my place or his. The neighbors on our street, who used to see me as just some gloomy widower, started thinking of us as an inseparable pair of old bodies. I knew all Thomas's habits, how he'd grumble at the local news, his thing for strong black coffee with no sugar, the way he'd wince when his right knee started aching before rain. One humid July evening, sitting under the grown maple, Thomas mentioned he was short of breath and had chest pains. I didn't listen to him saying it'd pass after a glass of water. I practically forced him into my pickup and drove him to the county hospital. For 2 weeks, while he was in the ICU after bypass surgery, I lived in hallways and parking lots, bringing him homemade broth and clean clothes. The doctors assumed I was his son or close family, and I never corrected them once, because that's exactly how I felt inside. When they finally discharged him, he looked gaunt, but getting out of the car, the first thing he did was walk over to our tree, run his palm over the bark, and say quiet that we'd both been lucky to survive out here in the sticks. Autumn brought cool air, and the leaves on our maple turned deep crimson. Thomas recovered slow from the surgery, moved even more careful than usual, spent most of his time in the chair on his veranda. One weekend, he asked me to help him go through old boxes that had been collecting dust in his garage attic for 3 decades. He wanted to clear out the junk, keep only what mattered, but physically couldn't haul heavy cardboard down that steep pull ladder himself. I spent half of Saturday carrying dust-caked boxes into his big living room. We settled right on the carpet, armed with damp rakes and garbage bags. Inside was a mess of old magazines, broken tools, old letters, receipts, yellowed photos in simple cardboard frames. Thomas went through each item, studying faces of people he barely remembered anymore, and set family documents aside in a woven basket. At the bottom of the fourth box we found a heavy wooden case with peeling lacquer. Thomas wrestled with the stiff latch until it finally gave with a dry click. Inside were old birth certificates, clippings from small-town newspapers from the early 1900s, and a thick leather album with a family tree his late mother had drawn by hand. I sat next to him, passing documents one by one, until my eye caught a familiar name on one of the darkened pages. There, among the branching records of Irish immigrants, in small, careful script, was my own grandmother's maiden name on my mother's side. She'd come to Texas from Missouri before the Great Depression. I asked Thomas to stop and took the document in my hands, not trusting my eyes. We started comparing dates, names, county names, pulling out my phone to double-check against state archives. 2 hours of tense silence and cross-referencing later, there was no doubt left. Our random meeting at a broken lawnmower had happened on ground that once belonged to one large family. Thomas's great-grandfather and my second cousin, once removed, had been brothers, fell out over a land deed, and cut ties for good in the 40s. Their descendants scattered across the country, lost all contact, until nearly a century later, two last lonely representatives of that line bought houses on the same property line in an Austin suburb. Thomas was quiet a long time, staring at the papers spread across the carpet, then looked up at me with tears in his eyes. He said now he understood why that maple had clung so stubbornly to life in the dried-out Texas dirt. That evening we went outside and stood a long time under the spreading crown of our tree, which didn't seem like just the result of some neighborly chore anymore. It felt like a real symbol of a family coming home. I pulled up next to this long concrete fence on the edge of town, palms already itching like they always do when I'm about to do something big. That nervous, sticky feeling in my gut, you know the one. I'd had this whole thing planned out for weeks, wrote it all down in a notebook, ran it past the family over dinner. Everyone was on board. I was after a golden lab, young, strong. That thick coat, the kind of energy that keeps a dog chasing tennis balls until they're wheezing. I'd already pictured it. Morning runs along the waterfront, those loyal eyes looking up at me, easy to train. In my jacket pocket, I had this brand new nylon leash, bright green, practically glowing, and a bag of dried meat for the first training session. I pushed through the heavy gate, and bam, this wall of noise hit me. Dozens of barks, all at once, uneven, chaotic. The place smelled like wet fur, cheap kibble, and that stale chlorine they use to cover up the real smells. A young guy in a gray county jumpsuit gave me a lazy nod and pointed down this endless row of metal cages, all wrapped in chain link. I walked past the first enclosures, and man, those puppies were putting on a show, jumping at the walls, whining, shoving their pink noses through the wire. Perfect little things, clean, ready for cozy living rooms. But I didn't stop. Don't ask me why. My feet just kept moving deeper into the place, where the barking got quieter and the air got heavier. I ended up at the very back, this last section tucked under an old maple tree. In the corner there was a cage that looked abandoned, except for this big, dark shape lying on dirty bedding. I stepped closer and I just stopped. forgot all about that green leash in my pocket. This huge dog was looking at me. Black coat once, maybe, but now his muzzle and paws were frosted over with gray, like he'd been out in the cold too long. His left eye had this milky film over it, and his right ear. Someone had torn it up bad once, left this old scar that had healed all wrong, crumpling the cartilage into this lumpy mess. He didn't rush the fence, didn't make a sound, just slowly pushed himself up on legs that clearly hurt, took 3 uneven steps forward, and pressed his broad forehead against the rusty wire right at knee level. There was something almost graceful about it, like he'd done this 100 times and knew exactly how it would end. The shelter worker caught up with me, tablet in hand, spat on the ground, and tapped his pen against the screen. Said the dog's name was Buster. Someone had tied him to a post with a short piece of rope and dumped him at the gates exactly a week ago, middle of the night. The guy added, almost as an afterthought, that the dog was old, had a laundry list of age-related problems, and honestly, no protocol, just between us. His adoption chances were basically zero. Everyone wants the healthy, happy ones. I looked at that gray face, and I could feel my perfect, weeks in the making plan just crumbling inside me. I knew I couldn't turn around and walk back to the labs. I reached through the fence and carefully touched the coarse fur between his damaged ear and that white skull. Buster didn't flinch, just pressed his head harder against the wire, and the old mesh groaned under the pressure. The worker mumbled something about safety, protocols, and quarantine rules, scratching the back of his neck, but I wasn't listening anymore. My fingers found an old leather collar around Buster's neck, cracked with age, the metal tag torn off, probably had his old address on it once. I asked the guy to unlock it. He sighed, jangled his keys, and slid back this heavy bolt with a nasty scrape. I stepped over the high threshold into this cramped, damp space. The darkened, matted straw crunched under my shoes, mixed with the gravel. I didn't even think about standing, just dropped right down onto that dirty bedding, ruined my new jeans, didn't care that the damp soaked straight through the denim at my knees. Buster froze for a second, his good eye fixed on me with this heavy, deep distrust, like he was waiting for the trick, the yell, the kick. Then he slowly shifted his front paws, claws scraping dry against the concrete. This massive dog had to be pushing 90 pounds, crept toward me, almost crawling. So careful, like he was terrified I'd disappear, or shove him away at the last second. When there was no space left between us, he lowered that huge, gray-muzzled head directly onto my lap. I felt the weight of it immediately, this crushing heaviness of someone else's aging life pressing down on me. He went still, closed his good eye, and let out this deep, long, vibrating sigh that shook his whole body from his shoulders to the tip of his tail. It wasn't whining, wasn't a complaint. It was the sound of absolute, final relief, like an exhausted person finally dropping a load they'd been carrying for miles. I put both hands on his broad back, feeling the coarse guard hairs, the strong but aging muscles around his shoulder blades. The worker stood in the doorway, leaning against the frame, watching us with this slight confusion, checking his watch every now and then, probably wondering how long this weird detour was going to take. I just sat there on the cold straw, stroking Buster's scarred head, and any last doubts about who I was living with today melted away. About half an hour passed before I got up off that concrete floor and led him out of that stuffy cage, holding him gently by the short loop of his old collar. He walked beside me, heavily favoring his back left leg, his white side bumping against my thigh every few steps. The admin building smelled like cheap plastic, old paper, and disinfectant. Behind the high counter, an older woman in a green county vest looked up, surprised. Her eyes moved from the bright green leash in my hands to Buster's weathered gray face, and she let out a heavy sigh, pulling a stack of forms from a drawer. I grabbed a pen and started filling out the endless boxes, barely looking. Name, address, phone, credit card for the mandatory fee. My hands shook a little, but I kept going, line after line, signing the health waiver, agreeing to all the county's strict rules. Buster stayed quiet the whole time. Didn't try to bolt, didn't react to the barking and shouting from down the hall, where other visitors were nervously eyeing his torn ear and his size. He just sat at my feet, pressed his whole body against my right leg, and buried his wet nose into the edge of my straw-stained jeans. His steady, heavy breathing vibrated through my boots, and the tangible connection felt like the most right thing that had happened to me in years. The woman stamped the papers with a blue seal, tore off my copy, and wished me luck, though her voice carried this mix of skepticism and pity for my impractical choice. I stuffed the documents in my jacket pocket, gave the leash a gentle tug, and told Buster to head for the door. He got up obediently, claws clicking on the linoleum, and we walked out into the sunlit parking lot together. I opened the back door of my clean SUV and helped him up onto the seat, already mentally rehearsing how I'd explain to my family in an hour why, instead of the promised golden lab puppy, there was this huge, half-blind old man sprawled on the living room rug. I didn't care what questions they'd ask, what the neighbors on our perfect street would say about his torn ear, his patchy tail, his cracked collar, because right then, from the back seat, someone took another deep, peaceful breath.